Professor in Education. And you will notice that Cynthia kindly turned the recording on, because what we will do in the session is we will record the delivery of then Tanya's talk. And then once we have done that, we will move into further discussion where the recording will be stopped, and you will then get the opportunity to freely explore the topic and to discuss it with Tanya. So Tanya's focus today is educational isolation. Can a school's place limit its access to resources? And I'm going to hand over to Tanya to tell us a bit more about herself and her work, and then today's focus.
Thank you, Lizana, and thank you for everyone for coming. I can see some familiar faces here, so it's lovely to see you all again. I hope I don't bore you if I'm going over similar materials that you've heard me talk about before. And I did think when Lizana asked me to speak to your rig, its relevance for governance. And it's actually a really good practice, I think, to think outside of where you would normally share and disseminate your research findings. Because I realised that I've been involved with governance pretty much my whole career, and I started teaching in 1990. In fact, Deb and I met a few years after that, didn't we, Deb? So we've known each other a long time. And because of the governance roles I've had, whether that's been in a governing body or as a trustee or as director of a multi-academy trust or a whole range of kind of governance responsibilities, all of those things come back to the school itself or the college, depending on which education sector you're in. And what is it about the school that impacts on the opportunities for its children in terms of their attainment, but also the staff? And the work that I do is focusing really very much on the place of the school. So where is that school, and how does the school's place affect its access to resources? What is it about its place that makes it different to other places? And it's been a long journey, really, to have the idea of place recognised by government as something that can impact not only on student attainment, but on access to teachers, for example. And I'll focus on that today, really. So that's teacher recruitment and teacher retention, because it's so granular. Each place is very different. And as you're very much aware, government policy looks at the bigger picture because it has to have that reach into dense populations in order to have an impact from the policy that it affects within schools. So bringing forward a proposition to the government that actually we need to look at schools on a granular level, and we don't need to treat the place as a challenge or a problem that the school leaders themselves aren't dealing with, because they are every day, because that's where their school is. We need to think about what the government can do in terms of its policies to create equity for those schools in a way that isn't there at the moment. Because treating all schools equally through funding policies, NFF, all the way through to the way in which pupils and students are assessed, treating schools equally is not equity, because they're not all starting from the same position. I wrote a paper recently, I think it was published in December, on the effect of education policy on small schools in England since 2010, and particularly small primary schools in rural and coastal settings. Because actually, I don't think anybody really considers the way in which policy, whether it's indirectly, unconsciously, or whatever, impacts on certain schools, because it's not considered that all schools are different and therefore have different contextual needs. So this was a really long preamble to get to the point that actually this is all about governance. It's all about the way in which governing bodies in their broadest sense within schools and also within colleges and within universities, within the whole education sector, have to really consider the way in which the place of the school, its community, its socio-economic position, its geographical position, and its cultural position has a relationship with what happens in that, I'm just going to say school from now on, in that school. And what I'd like to do today is share with you And I'm going to bring a PowerPoint up because I think sometimes it's easier to look at something when we're talking around it. And I've got a few things for you to do as we go through the PowerPoint as well. I'm hoping they're going to work. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed. Who knows with technology, but I'd like you to use Mentimeter this evening. I'm also going to share a YouTube animation with you as well. So I'd like you to think about what the concept of educational isolation is. And it's a concept that was established by Rowena Patty and I through the work that we started on coastal schools when we went into rural schools, and then we broadened it out as we realized internationally the concept of rural schools is something different to the way in which we perceive it, potentially in England, which is different slightly to Scotland, which is different to Wales, which is different to Northern Ireland, which is different to Eire. Definitely different to Norway. I've been doing quite a bit of work there. Definitely different to Montana. And smiling because she knows the people I'm talking about that we're working with. And so if you've got one term that's perceived differently in different places, what we were trying to do with the educational isolation concept was bring forward a term that could be used universally to try and talk about the same things without it being perceived as a deficit model against schools, because we're very keen to ensure that, because isolation's in the title, it's not about the schools being in deficit. It's about the way in which policymakers have to recognise the impact of those places on those schools. When I was talking about coastal schools, when I was working in Australia with Australian colleagues, it was really interesting that all the wealth in Australia goes to the coast. So the affluence is there. So completely different to England, and then going out into the islands and coastal areas of Scotland, for example. We know that as a country, as a nation, 4 nations, our investment in coastal areas has depleted over the years. Our House of Lords Seaside Town Regeneration report in 2019 told us that. So this was, again, motivation for us to have one concept that could be used between us, not just as an academy, but also within policy making and the wider community. It may not be that educational isolation is that term. It may be that we need to think again and think about a term or a concept that we can all use and feel really comfortable with. But it's a starting point. And I think I'll give you that in terms of my perception of research. As long as you've got a starting point and your moral compass is good and you're trying to make that positive difference, then I think that's okay. And we know, don't we, that a theory is just the main idea until another theory comes along to replace it. I won't go all postmodern on you. All truth is meaningless except for this truth. But it is something worth considering that, these ideas are ideas and hopefully something better will come along. But at the moment, this is what we've got. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, with you. It has my PowerPoint on it. Let's see. That's getting in the way. There we go. How's that? I can see Ron and Jan. Jan's nodding. Fantastic.
Perfect. Yeah.
So can a school's place limit its access to resources? And is educational isolation the answer to that? Well, let's see. Let's go through. I mean, you can take the teacher out of school teaching, can't you? But I still like to have an aim within anything that I'm doing. And so these are my aims for our session today: to introduce you to the concept of educational isolation. I always use this hashtag because place really does matter. To identify locational or place-based challenges to educationally isolated schools. So what is it that causes them to be educationally isolated? To suggest the role education policy plays in place-based challenges for schools. To reflect on the meaning and impact, and remember, impact's quite a difficult word to use if you're using qualitative research. We tend to use affected by or has a relationship with, because the quantitative researchers tend to want a causality, and it's really hard with education. All the complex variables that impact on education make that causality a very challenging statement to make. And then finally, to identify potential solutions to mitigate educationally isolated place-based challenges for school. Can we think of anything that can be done to improve opportunities for those that are negatively impacted? And what about those that are positively impacted? Can we take solutions that have already been put in place? because we have to remember that place can offer benefits as well as challenges. So I thought we'd start with a little bit about me. um, I always say to my PhD students and my master's dissertation students that actually research comes from a place of sometimes known but sometimes unknown experiences. And it's not rocket science, if you know me, to actually think about where my research on educational isolation and coastal and rural education has come from. So I actually grew up here on Romney Marsh. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I'm hoping that you can. On the very tip of the southeast of England. Now, I always laugh about the north-south divide when people talk about it in terms of, oh, you know, south is wealthy, the north isn't wealthy, or there are these opportunities in the south and they're not in the north. I grew up in one of the most socioeconomically deprived, geographically isolated and culturally remote places in the country. When I moved to Cornwall, it felt like I'd reached the big city. Romney Marsh, if you've ever been there, very, very remote. You know, our near neighbours, and the little train here, it's actually called the Little Train. Oh, I'm not sure why that did that. Let's go back. Was where was the train that my husband actually took to school, and many of my friends took to school. Um, it's a grammar school system in Kent, and I was the youngest of 5. And while I passed the 11 plus, I went to our local comprehensive like my 4 older brothers, which looking back was a really interesting experience because they did stream us very heavily. So those of us who passed the 11 plus went into a different group than the other children within the school. Whether that supported me being able to get on educationally, I don't know, but very interesting experience. I moved when I first started teaching in 1990, all the way to Penzance, so from one tip to the other tip. And again, a very geographically remote and socioeconomically deprived area of the country. So, as I said, not rocket science to understand why I've got such a deep interest on the way in which place has a relationship with education and with the way in which education outcomes can change. So these are some of the research projects that I've undertaken to lead to where I am now with the concepts that I'm putting forward. So it started back in 2010 with coastal schools research, although while it started in 2010, there was a lot of work, I'd say probably 3 or 4 years of work that went in before we got some funding and before the initial project started to take place. I'm still tracking the original schools that were part of that coastal schools research from 2010 onwards. Part of that research also included a 7-year longitudinal study. Rowena and I had a contract for a monograph to write it up. It's one of those things that I will do. I will get around to writing that monograph on the 7-year study. I've used it within different bits and pieces that I've written and reports and findings, but there's a lot of really rich data in that 7-year study. It's of one school, but it's of the children that started that school in 2010 and their experiences. We interviewed the same children for 7 years. We interviewed the teachers that taught them for 7 years and the principals that led that school for 7 years. We even recorded it. And at the end of the 7 years in 2017, we gave every child a little USB key with themselves growing up on it, a bit like 7 plus, so that they had something. What we also did was every year we gave the children a report on the findings of our investigations, both what they told us and what the teachers had told us. We also, as we do for all our research, we also looked at the whole system within which that school was working, and that became part of the reporting. So there are, 7, 14, there are 14 reports on that project that are available, that I can publish. And there are key reports that were published and are open access that give real insight into how a coastal school, and it was a large secondary school that was not achieving above benchmark. It was really not supporting the outcomes of the children that it was serving. why that was, how that happened, how Place had a relationship with that, and what the school tried to do following the new idea of an academy that came out of the Labour government, funding schools for the future money that schools were allowed to access around 2010. And how that changed with the also government policy of bringing in a superhead to turn the schools around. So there's some interesting work there, and there's some links in that, and I'm sure Lizana will share the PowerPoint slides with you afterwards. While all this was happening, I also was lucky enough to win some money from the Education Endowment Foundation and created an intervention called Retain, which was the early forerunner of the early career framework. And I was interested in this because I could see, again, within the educationally isolated schools I was working with, because at that point in time, I was head of school at the University of Plymouth, working in partnership with lots of schools across the region. I could see that they were really struggling to keep their, as we call them then, NQTs, so they're newly qualified teachers. They would come into the area, they would come into Cornwall, they would come into Devon, but they wouldn't stay very long. We'd be lucky to keep them for 2 years, typically a year. And so I'd contacted the Education Endowment Foundation to say, I think we've got a bit of a challenge here. Can I investigate it? And so the Retain programme was a way of testing an intervention piloted in Cornwall with early career teachers who were thinking of leaving the profession. It was incredibly successful. In fact, of all the teachers that participated in that, all of them except one are now school leaders, which is amazing, isn't it? They were thinking of leaving and then they didn't. I went on to advise the DFE about the Retain programme, and some of the elements of it were kept in the early career framework, as we know, mentoring, which is a good example. The flexibility and contextualised nature of Retain wasn't kept, and they also took out the career progression development module that I'd put in. All the research I did on why early career teachers leave teaching in order to understand how we can keep them in teaching showed me that they needed to understand their own profession, and that ITT gave them an insight, but it didn't really give them the depth of insight that they needed to know how to progress in their career. And so we had a whole module on that, exploring who they were as teachers. Did they want to stay in teaching and progress that way? Did they want to go into leadership? How did they do that? I think that's missing, and I was really, really pleased to read about Victoria government in Australia a couple of weeks ago, and I'd been advising them in the early stages of this, that their equivalent to the early career framework includes support for their beginning teachers to understand their own professional development as a teacher, and they're having great success with that. So in research, nothing's ever wasted, because you can use it to help and inform others' practice. So from that, because I was working with teachers in coastal and rural schools, and this was a primary school intervention, I was also interested in how I was conceptualizing the schools that I was working with. And this led into the Educational Isolation Project. We didn't actually call it that to start with, because the term came out of the leaders who responded to us in the large-scale survey that we sent out to school leaders. As a phrase that was repeated and repeated, we feel like we are educationally isolated. We didn't ask them, is your school education isolated? So it emerged actually from the school leaders themselves. And from that report, I was contacted by a large multi-academy trust who felt that all of their schools, apart from perhaps one or two, were educationally isolated. It was a large primary school only trust. And they wanted to use the educational isolation concept to restructure, and so this is key to their governance, to restructure the way in which they offered support across their schools to remove and mitigate the feeling of educational isolation. They were in a position where they were merging two trusts at the same point in 2019, ready for a 2020 brand new multi-academy trust. So they were able to do a complete restructure to create a hub school model. I'm going to talk to you about that in more depth later. But it was their governance, their approach to governance that really supported the success of that. And here are some sort of spin-off books and chapters that I've written around the topic. Because for me, the focus, and I'm a teacher educator of old, I suppose I still am, really. I do try and teach whenever I can, is on the biggest resource that all schools have, and that's their teachers. You know, what is it about being an educationally isolated school that leads to more challenges in recruiting and retaining high quality teachers? And I'm going to use that phrase, you know, advisedly, really, high quality. And I have written a chapter around what quality means when we're talking about teaching. And it does get taken with assessed outcomes more and more. But actually what I mean is teachers who are effective in supporting the best outcomes for their students. So some images of Cornwall to share with you. I live in Cambourne, which is between Penzance and Truro. This is Porthleven, and this is St Ives, two very different coastal scenes, but show an idyllic representation of what coastal living is like. And for those of us that live in coastal areas, we know it's not quite like that, particularly if you are reliant on seasonal employment and tourism to maintain any kind of income for most of your population. When place matters, it matters because of infrastructure, socioeconomic opportunities, culture, and geographic opportunities as well. What I'd like you to do now, because I've dropped lots of hints about what educational isolation is by the definition that Rowena and I have given it, what I'd like you to do now is actually tell me what you think it is. So there's a Mentimeter here. If you haven't used it before, it's very easy to access. You just go to www.mentimeter.com. And I'm just going to move that because I can't see that part of my screen because of faces on it. And then go to 4405 6219, or if you've got big screen and you scan that QR code with your phone, it should take you straight there. I'm going to start presenting the Mentimeter now, so you should be able to contribute. And this is where it gets a little bit technical. I'm going to have to stop sharing this screen. So hopefully you've all got the number now, 4405 6219. And I haven't got any responses yet, so I'm going to give you a little bit more time. And then I'll share the Mentimeter screen with you so you can see that as we get our live responses. Okay, we're going to go to the Mentimeter screen now. She hopes. Now, is that showing the correct screen? It doesn't look to me as though it is. Is that showing the Mentimeter screen? Excellent. Okay, that's good. So, fantastic. I had 6 responses so far. So, end of the line. It does feel like, particularly in Penzance. Removed from central support, lack of resources. Big one, as we know with word clouds, means most answers, and you can add more than one answer. Deprivation. Lack of peers. That's interesting. Low funding. It's moving around, not geographically isolated. Poor choice. I think you're saying there as poor choice, poor opportunity of choice. Lack of resources, isolated from networking, lack of recognition. That's interesting. Poor culture. Low funding again, deficit. Fabulous. These are really interesting answers. And some of those I haven't had before. Paucity of resources. I love the word paucity. Paucity of resources. Isolated from uncertainty. I think that's really important. Intergenerational issues. We found that again and again. And it's interesting, isn't it? I was having a conversation this week with somebody about aspirations and the lack of aspirations that exist within coastal and rural areas. And I don't think that's really the right way of looking at it. It's not a lack of aspiration. It's the connection between intergenerational lack of connection between what education does and what it can do for the families that have lived there for a long time. if a parent or a grandparent hasn't seen any benefit of education, then why would they invest in their child's education if they haven't seen anything come out of it for them? So this is really interesting. And I'm quite happy for you to turn your mics on if you want to talk to me about any of these outcomes. So I'm gonna pick on a couple of them. So there was somebody that put in not geographically isolated. I'm really interested in why you think educational isolation doesn't include geographical isolation.
That was me, Tanya Jan. And it was a question, really. I don't know whether the question more came up. I was thinking about you've got all those features of educational isolation, and I was thinking of places such as I worked in Stoke for 500 years, and I feel that that is an educationally isolated place to some degree. And there are also individual institutions that are maybe not part of a larger group. Are they educationally isolated? It was a query rather than.
It's such a good question, and it's one that I've wrestled with quite a lot. And the way in which I've kind of justified the geographical remoteness, and we use the word remoteness purposefully, is by arguing that, okay, so I went to give a talk in Blackpool for Blackpool Council in April
Yeah,
last year.
and Stoke is Blackpool, not on the coast, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that Blackpool is definitely educationally isolated in terms of the majority of its schools, yet it's geographically close. They have schools close to each other, and you would think that they would be working in partnership with each other because of that geographical proximity. But the geographical remoteness comes from not having the infrastructure to support the partnership connections and working with each other. So they may have the tram on the front, but when you get behind the front of Blackpool, the lack of frequent buses that can connect the schools with another school or with a university or with opportunities where the staff can share best practice, all of those things, they're remote from that. So I think it's a different way of looking at what remoteness is, what geographical remoteness is. But I think it's a really good question, and it could be something that we have to sort of redefine as we move forward with the concept of educational isolation. I have a PhD student working with me at the moment. Well, actually, she's been working with me for three years now, and it's a funded PhD because I wanted to explore whether it was possible to quantify educational isolation by looking at composite indicators. So the idea was that we'd create a composite indicator model that took the three elements of educational isolation and see whether we could create a computer program that would take the DFE data, and we'd be able to identify any school that's educationally isolated using those data. It's incredibly complex, and it's taken us over 3 years to get to a point where we've redefined each of those three areas, those three variables of educational isolation. And those three variables are, and I'll show you a short animation in a moment to hopefully clarify this: geographical remoteness, socioeconomic deprivation, and cultural isolation. So those three things we've been looking at, but the geographical remoteness, more and more I'm being told, well, actually, this school's close to that school, but we don't talk to that school, or this school has an opportunity to participate in this with the university, but actually we don't have the capacity to participate with, say, teacher trainees coming in. So yeah, very good question. And I think it's still one of those things that isn't as clear within the concept as we would like, and something that, yeah, we will be looking to develop. Sorry, Jan, you were going to say.
No, I was just going to say it's. I was trying to see if I could articulate in terms of a mentality of culture. I mean, in an aspiration, those complexities around what the result is of socioeconomic deprivation and not an aspirational culture, a lack of all those things will construct an educational isolation, whether it's geographical or not. which I thought was interesting. But anyway.
No, it is. It's really interesting, and it's the cultural isolation element of it kind of extends into the community itself as well. So that lack of opportunity to easily access things like museums or even leisure centres or shopping centres, things that if you're living in an urban setting you would take for granted. All of those things change the way in which the school can function, or it's different to the way a school can function in an urban setting. Trips and visits are impacted by not being in close proximity to the cultural opportunities that Ofsted would like all schools to participate in, those kind of things. And lack of cultural...
Even though that, sorry, I'm interrupting, but even in there, that you sort of go, yeah, but some mindsets are such that it's not for them, it's not part of who they are. But I will let you get on.
No, it's always good to talk to you, Jan. And I was just going to add to that the lack of cultural diversity in many of the areas that are coastal and rural, not all, but many, also makes for a different experience for the schools when they're leading opportunities for their children. So it's kind of an explanation of why we put those three things in, but actually they were the three things that were repeated again and again by the school leaders that responded to that first survey that we did of all school leaders in, and it was just England, sorry, Anne, all school leaders in England back in 2019, I think it was, pre-pandemic. So looking at, just going back to your word cloud, so deprivation is key, and I would argue that it really is a key feature of education in isolated schools. But here's a little interesting fact for you. If you go to a coastal school and you're from I think Lee Elliott Major has been calling it under-resourced now, and we've been calling it socioeconomically deprived background or persistently disadvantaged background, your outcomes will be poorer as a student, so your attainment will be poorer than a similarly disadvantaged child in an urban school. However, in a coastal school, that deprivation, take that away, you will still do less well than a child in an urban school, whether they're deprived or not deprived, or under-resourced or resourced. However, in a rural school, the only difference is between those who are persistently disadvantaged and those who are not. So in coastal schools, you do less well regardless of who you are, whereas in a rural school, you do less well if you're disadvantaged. So I think there's an interesting place divide between coastal and rural that still has to be unpicked, and something that we will be looking at, hopefully, in the near future. So end of the line, lack of support, all of those things, feeling ignored. I talk to a lot of school leaders who feel that their situation is persistently ignored. Rowena and I wrote a paper called Getting a Fair Deal, because it was the refrain that came up again and again from the teachers that we spoke to. I'm just going to get rid of the Mentimeter if I can. Can't seem to get the... Is it? Right. Ah, is that coming back? I'm trying to find... there you are. Okay. I can't find my stop screen sharing at the moment. It seems to have disappeared. Don't we just love Zoom? It's because Zoom has gone small for me. Okay, let me try and bring that out. No, it's disappeared again. Cynthia, can you... I've lost all the Zoom things at the moment. Ah, here it goes. It was hiding behind something else. There we go.
Well done, Tanya.
Found
well
it. That was fun. So I'm just going to bring that one back. Here we go. Sorry about that little hiatus for you. I'm going to try and share this screen again now. I thought I was being a little bit too adventurous there. So moving on from that, if it will let me. There we go. So just to reinforce the definition then, we wanted to have a broad definition that we could change over time if we needed to. So our starting definition in 2019 was a school experiencing limited access to resources for school improvement resulting from challenges of school location. And those challenges to the school's location, remembering that place and space are two very different things. So location is actually space, and place has all of the nuance of meaning within that community that the school is within. I'm a sociologist by background, so I've never really looked at these geographical differences until I started really thinking about place and space and what that meant. And I hear them mixed up quite a lot, but location is space, so the actual physical where it is, and place is the feeling that goes with the experience of being in that place. So I'm going to, I feel like I might be mad now because I'm actually going to try and share a YouTube video with you because I think it sums it up really well. And it's done it again. The Zoom has disappeared. It seems to be going to a different screen, so I can't, there we go. I'm going to stop the sharing that one and I'm going to share a different one if it will come up. Here it is. She says, hopefully. Why is that not appearing on there? I'm just going to do that. There we go. Okay, and I'm hoping I can share sound with you as well. Fingers crossed.
Educational isolation is when a school is in a place that experiences high levels of socioeconomic deprivation, cultural isolation, and geographical remoteness. Educational isolation can limit the school's access to the resources it needs for school improvement, such as a high-quality workforce, access to professional development and learning, and school-to-school support, and externally funded interventions. A school located in a place like this is educationally isolated. Educationally isolated schools in the UK are typically in rural, coastal, or ex-industrial areas, away from the large urban conurbations. Why does a school's locality matter? Because limited access to resources can limit outcomes for pupils, despite the best efforts of school leaders to mitigate place-based inequity.
So I just thought I'd share that with you, and I'll see if I can stop sharing that now and go back to our PowerPoint. Oh, turn that one off. There we go. And because of my teaching background, I always try and do things in different ways so that if understanding conceptually in one form doesn't work, then hopefully another will. And this was a poster I developed for the University of Durham's educational conference a couple of years ago, which I think, again, brings forward what the key elements of educational isolation are and the consequences that it has for schools. The two other consequences, so externally funded interventions and school-to-school support, it's been really interesting post-pandemic what's happened to the last one of those. So I saw an increase in the quality of online CPD for schools following the pandemic, because that was the only opportunity in the pandemic to access professional development and learning through online resources. As we've got further and further away from the pandemic, I hear again and again, well, it's actually better face-to-face, or, you know, the opportunities we have to do face-to-face CPD. I haven't seen any evidence, any empirical evidence to demonstrate that face-to-face is better than online, depending on the effectiveness or the quality of the resource behind it. And if somebody's got something on that, I'd really welcome it, because I hear it again and again. And that's fine face to face if you were within easy reach of another school or within easy reach of whoever's providing that CPD. But if you're not, it's typically too expensive and too time consuming to be able to attend. So I think we need to sort of refrain from face to face is better. Again, you need to contextualize it to the needs of the school and the school's workforce. So I've got a few concerns that are growing around that area again, because prior to the pandemic, there were fewer face-to-face external opportunities for CPD because of capacity and because of costs and because of time. And there was also reduced working between outstanding Ofsted graded schools, and I put that in inverted commas, and other schools who would have benefited from networking with them. I've not seen a great increase in that either. So I think that's an area, again, that once I have some more time, I'm going to re-explore. Externally funded interventions is an interesting one, because our school leaders told us in the research that they just didn't have the capacity to apply for additional funds in the way that large schools did, or schools that were working in partnership with other schools did. So in England, we've got the Multi-Academy Trust, which means that there are opportunities with central office to apply for externally funded interventions in a way that schools potentially in local authority control don't have. Small schools definitely find it more difficult unless they can get into partnership. So I think, again, there's that equity issue for schools being able to access funds that are available, and these include DFE funds as well, or to participate in interventions like those offered by the Educational Endowment Foundation. So place does impact on opportunities for school to improve through these things, through externally funded interventions. But it's one of those things that isn't really talked about. I had some really interesting conversations with local authority leads in London, and I still see them now. We still work together now, and they were two of them. So Lambeth and Hounslow, they were part of the London Challenge. They are, and they've written papers on this as well, because both have visiting fellows role, one with Oxford and one with Durham. They are categorical that the London Challenge funding wasn't the thing that made the difference to the London schools, because we know that if you're persistently disadvantaged and you go to a school in London, you will do better than any other child who's disadvantaged in the country. And it isn't to do with the London Challenge. The London Challenge allowed them to enhance the partnerships that already existed because of the close geographical proximity of those schools. What's really interesting about all of that as well is these schools in London, prior to London Challenge and post London Challenge and continuing now, were able to offer opportunities for staff, for school teachers and school leaders to work in different schools within the same borough without moving house or having any of the challenges that we have in rural and coastal settings when it comes to changing jobs. So they could change jobs, they could take promotion, those schools could be refreshed with new ideas and new opportunities by having new staff, whatever level those staff were at, in a way that rural and coastal schools can't, because it involves typically a move of house and a move of job for the spouse within the family or the partner within the family. Trying to find a job in an area of economic deprivation with challenges with housing, whether those houses are very highly priced because of the seasonal nature of the location and second homeowners, or very lowly priced because of the deprivation in the area, can cause all sorts of issues for teachers trying to move into rural and coastal areas that don't exist within urban settings. Yes, I recognise that house prices are really expensive within London, but there's a much easier to access rental market in London than there is in rural and urban rural and coastal settings. So I have focused for the last 15 years on the high quality workforce. And this is what the school leaders told me was the key challenge for them in their schools that they perceived to be educationally isolated, It was hard to recruit and retain early career teachers. There were fewer opportunities for middle and senior leaders, and there was actually a lack of churn at middle and senior, middle teacher level. So they would typically go to the school at the beginning of their career and then not leave. And that's an infrastructural challenge as well that's creating that. And more unqualified teachers than in other schools. And those infrastructural challenges that surround educational isolated places, you know, we can't emphasize those enough, really. The limit to transport, the limited or no public transport. Somebody put on the word cloud, end of the line. Yeah, you can get to Penzance on the train, a train that runs through Cornwall, but it runs through a very limited part of Cornwall. And if you want to get out of Cornwall and go to London, you have to go via Devon. So you kind of go a very convoluted way. But you get to Penzance, and then from Penzance onwards, we've got a school in Cape Cornwall, right down the bottom of Cornwall. Now, if you think about the region of the southwest, it's Gloucester down to Cape Cornwall as its furthest school. It takes me from Camborne probably an hour and a half to get to Cape Cornwall on a good day. If we're in tourist season, add an hour to that, maybe more. One-track roads on some points of that. What's been interesting about the educational isolation concept, though, is that in the new composite indicator model that Philly Eigelhart, who is my PhD student, and I are creating, we don't talk about distance anymore. We're talking about time. So working with colleagues internationally, it's really clear to me that the concept of time is more important than the concept of distance. Because actually, when we were using a system called TRACK, which is what the government uses to track all our journeys, really. So how long does it take to get from Camborne to Penzance at particular times of the day, for example? It may look like it's really close, it's 13 miles away, but actually it really does depend on the traffic and the season and all of those things. So we now think about time. What's a reasonable amount of time to ask a school teacher to travel to work? What's a reasonable amount of time to expect the children to travel to go on a trip or a visit or to learn to swim? You know, how long is reasonable? Distance actually doesn't equate to time because it's different depending on where you are. So we're thinking about that now. And if there's no public transport, how does that add to it? The cost of having a car. If you're an early career teacher, you really do have to have a car if you want to work where I live, if you want to work where Anne lives. It's just not possible otherwise. So you have to have a driving license, but you've also got the expenses of the car. The housing, the employment opportunities that surround that community and the way that impacts on the families that the school serves, and all of those cultural facilities that, and if you think about this in relationship just to recruiting and retaining teachers, if you're an early career teacher, and we'll take a traditional early career teacher, so a younger first job early career teacher, they move to rural Cornwall or rural Scotland to do their first teaching job. Yeah, there are loads of benefits to that, being in the countryside, small communities that they might be able to participate in. But actually, if they're a younger early career teacher and they want access to things that potentially they've always had access to, who knows where they've come from? They might have lived in the city beforehand, but they haven't got a shopping centre nearby. You have to think through to get your food each week. It's a journey. Accessing doctors, accessing going out, meeting people, all of those things. All of those community aspects have an impact on our teaching workforce, but we don't really talk about that. We tend to talk about salaries, we tend to talk about hours and workload, but place impacts on our teaching workforce too. And when we're in a governance role within a school, or we're thinking about the way in which schools are governed, it's not typically something that's on the agenda for discussion. I know you know this, but I think it's always useful to remind all the green bits are rural countryside living. We are a green island, even though it may not feel like it. I know where I live, there's so much housing going on, and we've got a government who's got really high housing quotas in place. But actually, we are a rural nation. We're also a coastal nation if we look at the periphery that goes all the way around our island. So we know that in England, it's 20% of primary roughly and 16% of secondary schools that are rural. We've got 17% of England in sparse settings as well. So while our government policy, and policy always follows those densely populated areas in terms of attempting to create an equal opportunity, 17% of it isn't densely populated. I'm going to show you quite a startling little factoid here. So coastal villages with populations less than 5,000 are not reported by the ONS, so the Office for National Statistics. Did you know that? I mean, that's quite shocking, isn't it? So those very sparsely populated areas of coastal seaside towns, not even towns, little hamlets, not reported. We don't know what goes on there. Do they not count? Is that equity? So we know that in terms of coastal and rural, we've got some real issues going on in terms of there's a large percentage of our population live there. Oh, sorry, not a large percentage, a good percentage of our population live there. I'm going to be generous. About 20% of our population live there, so a fifth. Yet we have all of these challenges that come out of it. So the gap between coastal and non-coastal communities could also be replicated for rural communities. Lower economic output, lower employee pay, lower number of degree level qualified residents. So there are challenges, and those challenges lead into our schools workforce. And some quotes there for you on coastal rural and coastal urban schools, which I wanted to include, and why I was pleased about Jan's comment as well, because I think there are some real challenges in coastal urban schools like Blackpool, or areas like Blackpool, that experience educational isolation still. Just give you a moment to read those. And I think coming out of that, you can also see this issue of intergenerational lack of outcomes that education has given to the people of these communities as well. You know, work hard, you get a good job. Where are the good jobs? You know, where's that representation to support that expectation that education is going to do something different for your children? I'll say it once, I'll say it a lot. Place does matter. Again, those beautiful images to remind you of rural and coastal living. So let's have a little bit of a deeper look into a high quality and stable teacher supply. Again, some voices from our school leaders that spoke to us during our research projects. You know, our staff face challenges in travelling in, and this has a knock-on effect on recruitment and retention. I mentioned just now, you know, the need to have a car. We also struggle in terms of getting quality staff. It was one of those moments when I was disaggregating DFE data, because I was absolutely convinced that the DFE data didn't represent the level and number of unqualified teachers that we have in our schools at the moment. And I was going through it, and it was really odd. It was always around 9 to 12%. From all the way back to 2009 to now, it's always around 9 to 12%. And I went to the Festival of Education. I was having a chat with Jack Worth. I said to him, do you know what's going on with the DFE data around unqualified teachers? And he said, oh, it's stable. You know, they're the same numbers as they always are. I said, I don't think it's true. That's not what I'm seeing when I'm going into schools. And head teachers are telling me I've got no choice but to hire unqualified teachers, but I'm putting them on temporary contracts so that they have to qualify as a teacher within 3 years, because, you know, we see the importance of being a qualified teacher, but I need an adult in the classroom. And I was hearing that again and again. And again, this is a real governance issue for schools. And I had one of those moments, one of those Gestalt moments. It's because they're temporary contracts. So the DFE data only reflects those on permanent contracts. So we've got an iceberg of unqualified teachers in this country. Most parents don't understand that in 2012, Michael Gove deregulated teaching and allowed all multi-academy trusts and free schools and studio schools to employ unqualified teachers in England as they saw fit. The government made a pledge when they came in that all new teachers would be qualified. They asked to speak with me about it, actually, about what that means in real terms of, translating that promise. And I talked to them about, well, it depends what you mean by new teacher, doesn't it? Is that new to teaching? Is it new to teaching a phase? What do we do with the thousands and thousands of unqualified teachers we already have? As some of them might have been teaching for 12 years now, 13 years. A long time. We don't want to lose them from the profession because they will have built up experience. So it's that quality of staff. And what seems to be happening is in the schools where we need the highest, most dedicated staff to support those children who are most vulnerable and have had, the biggest challenges of the education system themselves, seems to be where we have the teachers with the least experience or being unqualified. And then we wonder why the attainment gap isn't closing. We've got some real issues as a country to really challenge. And I'm hoping that the task isn't so big that it never actually gets sorted out. School leaders also told me trying to recruit young staff to coastal rural areas is very difficult, and talented teachers and middle leaders often leave. They want to work in a better school, or they want to work somewhere where they have opportunities to enjoy their life in the way that they want to as well. So lots of feedback from school head teachers about the challenges that they were having in recruiting and retaining. Just some summary points there about the way in which students can be negatively affected by a school's place as well, in the way in which limiting access to teachers limits their access to support to do the best that they can do. And that's everything that I've just discussed with you. And there are reports on this. I've had a chapter that's been in the offing. I wrote it in 2021, I think. Updated it in 2023, but the book still hasn't been published. And Luke Graham, whose data is there for you in the second graph on the right-hand side, I published a paper that he wrote in a special issue journal that I'm co-editing with Jane Downey and Yael Grishton on rural and urban educational experiences, because I wanted to get it out there. So it's a little bit, when you're a researcher, you'll probably realise and know this and feel this when somebody publishes before you, when you've already written it up and you're waiting for it to come out. But it's good that it's out there. What I'm sad about is we don't have more up-to-date data to be able to use. So Luke's data is from the EDACI, and it balances rural schools against urban schools in terms of GCSE performance. And you can see that GCSE performance in rural schools relates directly to level of deprivation of the student. So it's, as I said right at the beginning, if you are persistently disadvantaged and live in a rural area, your educational outcomes will be not as good as those of disadvantaged children in urban areas. So place is a factor, not in a quantitative sense, but a factor in the outcomes that you're likely to expect. And here's some more evidence to support that for both coastal and for rural schools. I won't go into that now, but again, when you get the PowerPoint, you can look through and hopefully click into all of the sources for that. Unfortunately, it goes beyond school and into social mobility and progression into university as well. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but social mobility in the UK, not just in England, but in the UK, is worse in the southwest of England than it is anywhere else in the country. And that report came out, I think it was 3 years ago, from the University of Exeter for the Southwest Social Mobility Commission, and it's definitely worth taking a look at that. Progression opportunities, really poor. So what's the government's response to all of this and understanding how place has a relationship with schools and school outcomes and schools' access to resources. Well, we had opportunity areas in 2017. We had 12 to start with, and it was very interesting for me going to Blackpool, being a recipient of opportunity area funding and knowing that they also had additional funding through the Blackpool Challenge. When I was giving my keynote presentation, I stopped and I asked everybody in the room, and it was all the school leaders, about 250 people there, and also public sector leaders as well. How many of you know about the opportunity area funding? Every hand went up in the room. Okay. How many of you feel that there's been a lasting legacy and impact of that opportunity area funding for Blackpool? Not one hand went up. I felt a little bit for the head of the council who was there, who was trying to encourage them. Yes, yes, you know, we've got this, we've got that. And they were saying, no, that hasn't continued. So the sustainability of the investment in skills and young people and the development of the area through education hasn't been seen within that opportunity area. So place was recognised as something that needed additional support, but the policy that enacted a change doesn't seem to have had the impact that the government were hoping. We've had education investment areas. That's been articulated through the Education Endowment Foundation, I believe, more than anything else. I know that I was involved with an EEF project called Ascents that's just finished, and I was asked to participate in it because they wanted to use Cornwall and Plymouth, which are education investment areas. Ascents was a project to train university students as mentors to go in and support GCSE science outcomes in schools by mentoring the most disadvantaged children with a certain predicted grade. It actually worked really well. It worked well in Plymouth because we were able to have easy access for our students to get there. It was much more difficult in Cornwall, and I did explain this to the EEF because the distance that they had to travel from Plymouth to get into Cornwall, and I did try to recruit HE students from University of Falmouth and from Cornwall colleges, but couldn't get any. Nobody wanted to do it, and they were paid for the role as well. So I did recommend that we move to online mentoring, but was unable to persuade EEF that that model would work. So it's interesting, isn't it? The distance was definitely a problem there, and the time that it took. The two mentors that we maintained they came to Truro to do their mentoring to university students. They effectively took a whole day to come and do the mentoring with a travel either side of that. So a whole day to do 1 hour of student mentoring. The recruitment and the retention strategy, well, we know that that's been in action and has had wide scale consequences for education. We've had the early career framework, we've had MPQs, we've also had the initial teacher training market review. In terms of place, I have written a little bit about the way in which the market review has impacted on place and made it even more difficult for educationally isolated schools to access teacher trainees. So again, it's that unintended consequences of policy I think we have to sort of be mindful of. The National Institute of Teaching has been doing a lot of work around coastal and rural schools and the way in which the early career framework has been put into place in those schools. NPQs, Church of England has been working on NPQs small to support small school leaders. So it's been interpreted and contextualised to try and support place-based things, but not necessarily by the government, but the way in which it's rolled out and hasn't worked initially. Levelling up, I can't really say a lot about that because I haven't seen much impact of it. These approaches, you know, they have tried to recognise the challenges with recruitment and retention, and there was a massive ESRC call for education, which also considered place within it. I know the Nuffield is also thinking about place and education, but we need it to roll through into policy now. The DFE did fund the Rural Teaching Partnership, which was the Church of England, Teach First and Chartered College of Teaching in 2021. We haven't really heard very much about it. I was involved in Truro because we were allocated 10 potential places for teachers in rural schools across the Diocese of Truro. We were only able to place one because there wasn't the capacity in the rural schools to do it. What it makes me think of is when we're considering the way in which these interventions work, you need to understand and provide opportunities for trainee teachers to experience rural living and coastal living and the place-based communities that they might think about working in the future. Because if you go there and you've never experienced it, it might be more of culture shock than you're expecting. There's been some really good work by Jane Downey at the University of Montana doing a kind of 6-stage introduction to working in rural and small schools in Montana. And it demonstrates that actually that kind of gentle integration into thinking about working rurally and working coastally leads to much better teacher retention later on, and also to recruitment. So there have been initiatives and things have happened, but I think it's still one of those, well, I know it's one of those areas that we really need to impress upon the government that needs further consideration. I wanted just to reiterate at this point that educational isolation is not a deficit model of schools. It isn't. It's a way of understanding their places so that we can leverage governments and policymakers to consider equity when they're creating their policies, so that place is considered and understood and strategies and interventions can be adapted and contextualised to create the equity that they should be entitled to. I realise that I've been going for quite a long time now. I don't know, before I start talking about a particular case study that links directly to governance, I don't know if you wanted to take a quick comfort break. How does that feel? I can only see Anne at the moment. What do you think, Lizana?
Hi, Tanya. I think if we say we're flexible and colleagues can take the break when whenever they feel sensible for themselves, then because I'm mindful it's 5:20, so I reckon if we go through the case study and then we move into Q&A, would that be okay?
Yep, that would be perfect.
Okay.
Okie dokie. I won't be offended if you need to run off to loo or get a cup of tea. So this case study I thought was an interesting example of the way in which educational isolation as a concept has been used by a large multi-academy trust to mitigate the challenges that were faced, as it perceived it, by its educationally isolated schools. The trust, I'll just add this in now, the trust has changed its leadership. So it's got a new CEO, and the CEO has maintained a model of hub schools, but she's actually called them clusters now, but they're still working in the hubs that they had. And the recommendations that were made from this particular case study were instigated by the new CEO and seem to be working very well. So just to sort of add that in there. So this hub model, the idea behind it was that by geographically co-locating a set of primary schools within this one multi-academy trust, they could act as their greatest resource for each other. So the, oh, sorry, somebody's got their, okay, so if you could turn your mic off, that would be good.
In Phoenix, can you just kindly mute yourself? That'd be really great. Or Cynthia, if you can assist us there, that'd be fantastic.
I think he's trying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, colleague who's screening in Phoenix X6517. Can you kindly please mute yourself? Cynthia?
Oh, there we go.
That's
Lovely.
great.
Thank you.
you.
Sorry, it was just I couldn't hear anything in my headset. So it was a 3-year longitudinal study, qualitative research, and started in 2019, but we didn't know that there was going to be a pandemic. Oh, I'm afraid you've unmuted yourself again. Thank you. So we didn't know there was going to be a pandemic, and that caused issues right at the beginning of the research, because one of the things we shouldn't do as a researcher is impact on the participants who are kindly giving their time. So we changed the way in which we were conducting the research. We were going to have interviews with all of the head teachers every year of the research project. But in 2020, because of the pandemic, we only interviewed the hub leads and the executive leadership team to reduce the impact that we were having on the rest of the colleagues within the school. But it was incredibly interesting. So we started off with a focus group, and we spent the whole day with the executive leadership team and the senior leadership team, which comprised of all the head teachers, to understand what they understood about their schools, whether they considered their schools to be educationally isolated, and whether they understood what the hub model that the new multi-academy trusts, so remember these were 2 trusts that were merging together, what the new trust was trying to achieve by creating the hub school model. And so we talked to them about it, and that gave us real insight into our interview questions, which we repeated over the next 2 years as we were interviewing. And we found out that actually headship, and perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by this, but headship is a really lonely experience. And that one of the benefits of the hub model was that it took away that loneliness. So by creating these small groups of schools that were working together, these strong relationships, these trusted and supported relationships emerged between these groups of head teachers. So each of the hubs, the head teachers had a hub lead who would cascade information from the executive leadership team, although there was a really good communication system across that mat as well to make sure that everybody understood what the MATS directives were, but actually it was fed back as well. So it was a 2-way system. So all the way to pupils and parents, the needs of the MATs and the needs of the pupils, the parents, and the teachers in between, all knew what they were all trying to achieve. And it was a combined opportunity to understand how to get there. And the hub supported that because of this rich relationship that developed between the school leads in each of the hubs. It also meant that they got to know their communities really well, that they ended up running one-day events that invited the community in. They had employers, they had parents, and they could see how working together in their community and with their community benefited their students' outcomes. They lent each other things, they lent each other resources. This included Ofsted resources during inspection time, all the way through to minibuses. If one school had a minibus and another, or if a member of staff was off sick or away, they could share across schools. All of the schools were within 30 minutes travelling time, which they felt was a reasonable distance to travel to be able to go and talk to each other and collaborate. Their communication was really good. They had this large but local ethos. It's amazing that that came out, that large but local, and we called one of the papers Large but Local. Out of the interviews, several of the school leaders said that exact phrase to us. We may be large, but we're local. We know what we need to do to support our community. There were things that needed to be considered. Hub synergy. All the hubs were experienced differently. Some of the hub leaders weren't clear on exactly what their role was. Some felt that it was more a line management kind of role. Others felt that it was a collaborative peer support role. And the central processes that underpinned it weren't very clear either. So they allowed the contextual differences between the hubs to exist. Sometimes that was a benefit, but other times it didn't help for bringing sort of synergy between hub leaders in what they were doing and what they thought was expected of their role. But overall, the strengths outweighed the areas for consideration. And here's some of the voices of the head teachers and the hub leads that we spoke to during the research in terms of their relationships. I think it speaks for itself, really. The whole trust meeting is more like a conference. I feel a bit safer in a hub model. I was talking to one of the small school head teachers, and he was saying when he first moved to the trust, because he was new to the trust the year it became the new multi-academy trust, that he didn't feel like he could say anything because his school was smaller, and he didn't feel that he had the same experience as the other head teachers within the trust. And it was really difficult at those first meetings. But actually, when he got back to his hub and he was speaking to his 4 or 5 colleagues who were also school leaders, and they listened to him, and he was able to share things that had worked in best practice within his school, it built his confidence, and he felt that he could go back to the whole trust meetings and share what he felt would benefit the whole trust, which demonstrated actually there were really unintended benefits of having this hub model in terms of developing the confidence and opportunities for the leaders within it. The sharing of resources happened pretty much immediately. So collaboration, sharing expertise, not feeling like you're on your own. I said, being a head teacher is quite a lonely experience, and it took that away. They felt like they always had somebody to turn to and to talk to about what they needed to do, but also the resources that they wanted to have were now in reach of them, which they didn't have before. And remember, if we go back to educationally isolated schools, those resources included having access to teachers as well as to the physical things that they needed to run their schools. Communication was a key benefit of the hub model. It was hierarchical deliberately because the trust CEO wanted to ensure that the mission, the values, the vision of the trust were cascaded throughout the schools of the trust. So the schools of the trust would keep their own individual identity and support their communities, but actually they would be working within the trust as part of it and be supported by it, which is why I've kind of created that expanding pebble diagram there. So each person within that trust and within that school would understand what they were trying to achieve. The most effective hubs were the ones that shared advice, resources, ideas, events, practical solutions, all the things that I was just talking about. And they had regular meetings together. And the schools had that geographical closeness, and that hub lead acted as a link between the schools and communities. I would argue that there was one hub that was more challenged than the other hubs, and that's because the hub lead felt that it's interesting, they felt that they were different, that hub was different to the other hubs, that they didn't have as much to learn, that they came fully formed, and that each of their schools should just be left to get on with it. So it caused a little bit of tension at the beginning. But it's interesting, after 3 years, it kind of settled down and they could see the benefits of the hub model. But it did have one school that was slightly outside of the 30 minutes remit. And I don't think that helped either, because that school did feel that they weren't getting as much support as the other schools within the other hubs. So we gave them considerations for enhancement. And as I just said to you, all of those were taken on because there was a transition in trust leadership as we ended the project. So that was to establish a clear job description and role for the hub leads to avoid the conflating of headship of the school or trust roles, because many of the hub leads also had a head teacher role, or they had safeguarding lead role or something like that for the trust. So that clarity needed to be there. To recognise the differences will exist between hubs. So, it's reflecting on the context. The trust was really clear that they wanted each school to have its own identity and to be part of its own community, but to be supported by the trust. So the processes that were needed to standardise things such as practices across the trust had to be implemented, but with that reflection on context as well. So it was a hard balance, but knowing the trust still, they've actually really nailed it now. It does feel as though they are one trust, but with many schools that each have their own identity within their communities, but within their hubs, they have support. The hub size was important, the school's proximity, really important, not too big and not too far away from each other. They decided in the end that 5 schools was the optimal number. I went to our what's it called? Research Ed Cornwall in October. And I went to one of the presentations there and was delighted to hear that another trust had implemented hubs based on the report that came out on this hub case study. And they were finding it really effective in terms of sharing resources between their very small schools, and their very small schools were also in close proximity. So it's really heartening when you hear that the work that you've been doing is actually making a difference to other schools as well. And then finally, specific school context. So when I was interviewing the head teachers, they were talking to me about their small school or their faith school, and that actually they were still networking with other small schools and other faith schools because of the specific support that they needed in terms of the differences that those contexts had. So, for example, small school curriculum or faith school inspection. The new CEO has actually brought in contextual networks within the trust as well. So not only are you within a hub and you have all the support that your geographical hub gives you, you also have the support of your contextual network. So that whether you're a small school or a faith school or both of those things, and they're finding that that's working really, really well. So concluding on the case study then, small groups of education isolated schools working together, and this is a really important consideration for governance, in a commutable geographical proximity does support school improvement because of that improvement in access to resources. It does show that there's promise to the benefit of education isolated schools of a hub school model. And I've met with an organisation called PTI a couple of years ago, and I'm meeting with them again soon, who create hubs for schools and formats across England as a way of improving opportunities to share resources. They had trusted, caring relationships that allowed them to do that sharing, and we can't underestimate that. We know that education is a social experience, and that opportunity to create those relationships is a step that can't be missed out. It does take trust in order to share expertise and practice and development opportunities, and challenge as well, to push back and challenge and show what isn't working. A clear framework for collaborations needed between school leaders and schools and across the mat. It creates that community of practice for them within their own community. And the hub model facilitated a communications process that dared to prioritise localised and contextual information and to benefit each school and school within it. I see very poor communication in some organisations, and then they wonder why messages get changed and outcomes aren't what they anticipate. Communication is so important, but again, it's a step that isn't really deliberately considered. And the hub model showed how important that communication system was. Before I stop for questions, I just want to share with you that I've got some new research coming out. Hopefully by May, I'll have the report finished. It's been 2 years, a 2-year research project, but 18 months of primary data collection. So 2 years in total. And it's directly linked to governance. So a very large MAT contacted me when they read the Locality Matters report about the hub school model and asked me whether I would like to research them changing the way in which they governed their schools. So many of their schools were educationally isolated, still are educationally isolated, and they found that for quite a high proportion of their schools, they struggled to get the skill set in their local advisory body. They called it their local governance body. And so they were really finding it hard to get the governors that they needed, with each school having a separate local governance body. So they consulted with parents, with their school leaders, with the community, and decided to create hub advisory boards. So they drastically reduced the number of governors that they had across the whole multi-academy trusts. They removed local governance bodies from each school and created 5 hub advisory boards with 44 members. And each of those hub advisory boards advised on a group of schools that were geographically located and included primary and secondary schools. I put a pre-HAB, we'll call it a HAB, Hub Advisory Board. I put a pre-HAB survey out to do a baseline assessment of understanding of what it was going to be, but also the skills of the new Hub Advisory Board, and then put mid surveys out to see how it was going. And then after 18 months, I put further surveys out, and I surveyed parents and carers at that point as well to see how it's working. It's been really, really interesting. I'm not going to give anything away at this point. My key research question was, in what ways does a governance hub model meet MAT local advisory board level governance requirements effectively? So the idea is, does this work? Could other MATs have a more highly skilled set of governors doing it this way than the old way of having school-based local advisory boards? So I won't give any spoilers, but keep an eye out for that, because I think it's going to be a really potentially controversial but interesting report. My final Menti, I was going to actually ask you, the role that governance plays in mitigating place-based inequity for schools. I'm still really interested in this, and I would really appreciate you doing it. I'm quite happy to put it on screen. I can see we've got 20 minutes left. I think we've probably got enough time. What do you think, Lizana?
I do think it'd be interesting, Tanya, so happy to do that.
Okay, in which case I'm going to go into this rather nerve-wracking, stop sharing that screen and try sharing another screen for a moment. Bring that one back up on Menti. No, that's decided to... Oh, my Menti's completely gone. If you bear with me one moment. I think I panicked when it started going on to another YouTube video. I had a bit of an issue with a YouTube video when I was presenting the other day. Oh no, found it. There we go. Super duper. I'm just presenting that one now. There we go. So if you'd like to share your thoughts with me. So understanding everything that I've explained about the concept of educational isolation and the work that I've done in looking at educational isolated schools and some potential interventions to mitigate the place-based challenges of educational isolated schools. What role do you think governance plays in this, in mitigating place-based inequity for schools? So that's open now. The number's the same. It's 44056219, and you should be able to put your responses in.
People are doing it, Tanya. I'm just wanting to say thank you so much for sharing your thought-provoking and insightful research with us, and also your considerations in terms of government governance, and then again moving it to then the strategic wing within multi-academy trusts, and also how that needs to be considered. So I think there's plenty to talk about in the Q&A. So once we have got some responses and you've explored that, I'm happy for you to just move straight into the Q&A aspect.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lizana.
Lovely.
How are we going? Are you able to access the Menti? Oh, yeah, here we go. Fabulous. Helps with fairness and equity. Yep. Challenge awareness, hold to account. Yeah, which is actually you know, I'm a member of a multi-academy trust, and I feel that that's my job to hold to account. Local governance can be sensitive to specific features of place-based inequity. Local governance can, and it's interesting because, again, it's different in the 4 nations, but it's recognising, isn't it, when multi-academy trusts, do they have the issue of place and their school's specific location? Is that something that's discussed within governance meetings, particularly at MATS level and board level? Move from urban-based and directed policy to place-based. Yes, please. I think localised community governance can play an influential role, but only if policy is flexible enough. It's true. I mean, every school leader has to enact the policy that they've been required to do. They don't have a choice with that. Some try to flex. I'm just trying to see if I can get the... Oh, no, what have I done? No, I didn't mean to do that. I'll put that back on. There we go. I was trying to see this one down here, but I couldn't see it. Ah, there we go. Essential for govs to understand the local, leads on culture and sets tone, appropriate delegation to schools in MAT. These are all really, really important and really useful comments. Have I missed any out? I don't think I have. It's interesting, isn't it, when you think about place-based inequity for schools and governance, because governance, as you're the experts in, you know, it radiates across levels. It's you know, if we think, you could take a Bronfenbrenner approach, couldn't you? And it's that ecosystem of governance, you know, from the micro all the way through to the systems level approach to governance, and the way in which our policymakers govern our schools. And I always feel that place is not a key feature of consideration within governance, but perhaps it should be. But policy doesn't lend itself to that. Is anybody else writing? Gives a voice local. I think we said that one. Okay, in which case I'm going to just shut that one down now and stop sharing.
Super, thanks so much, Tanya. In the meantime, as you're shutting things down, if anyone has a question for Tanya, please click on the React button. You'll see its little heart-shaped icon at the bottom of your screen on the navigation bar. Click on that, and then you will be able to select your virtual hand. So if you want to just click on your virtual hand, then we can see if you want to contribute or ask a question. Observations are welcome too. And Cynthia, could you please stop recording for us? That'd be great.